Hey guys, tonight we begin with a question that sounds simple, but turns out to have a genuinely strange answer. How did people actually use money in medieval England? And why, if you were dropped into the 13th century with a handful of coins, would you fail to buy anything before lunch? The answer involves silver discs, split wooden sticks, 6 centuries of creative debt management, and at least one building that no longer exists, for reasons we will get to. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you are tuning in from and what time it is for you. It is always fascinating to see who is joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Congratulations! You have just woken up in 13th century England, and you have money in your pocket. That is, broadly, where the good news ends. What you are holding is not so much currency as it is a small, slightly irregular disc of silver that at least 3 different people will disagree about at 4 different prices before noon, including, very possibly, the man who made it. The coin is a penny. 1 silver penny, hand-struck by a worker who positioned a blank disc between 2 iron dies and hit it with a hammer. The resulting object is technically round, more or less. If you tilt it toward the grey morning light coming through the gap in your shutters, you can see the faint impression of a king's face on one side and a cross on the other. The cross is there partly for reasons of religious symbolism, and partly because it makes it straightforward to cut the coin into halves and quarters when someone needs a halfpenny or a farthing, which is going to happen before the morning is finished. The penny is the unit on which this entire economy runs. Everything is priced in pennies, or in fractions of pennies, or in the 12 pennies. To a shilling 20 shillings. To a pound structure that will give you a quiet headache if you attempt to think about it before you have eaten something. There are larger coins, occasionally, but the penny is what most people handle, and even the penny is more aspirational than common in some communities. Most transactions in your village do not involve coins at all. We will get to that. The penny in your hand weighs roughly 1.5 grams. It should. Anyway, whether yours does is a question that would require a very precise scale to answer. You don't have a scale. Your neighbour doesn't have a scale. The baker at the market doesn't have a scale, though he has strong opinions and a practiced eye, which in this context is nearly the same thing. The silver in the coin is its actual value. Medieval currency is not fiat money. The coin is worth what it is physically made of, not what a government declares it to be. A silver penny is worth a penny because it contains approximately a penny's weight of silver, which means that if someone has been at your coin with a small file and shaved the outer edge, your penny is now worth measurably less than a penny. And there is no stamp, no printed denomination, and no mechanism available in this century to tell you by how much. You turn it over between your fingers. The edge feels smooth, the way all coins feel. You bite it gently, the way you've seen others do. It yields slightly. That means it is silver and not lead, which is something. Whether it is full-weight silver is a question that will be settled later, at the market, by a vendor who has examined 1,000 coins, and will not be moved by your expression. The cold disc sits in your palm. Real money, probably. The smell of bread finds you before the market does. You follow it across the packed earth of the main road, past the low timber buildings with their mud, and straw walls and their shutters still half closed, past the sound of someone's goat having a strong opinion about something on the other side of a fence. The baker's stall is already open. The loaves are stacked in brown rows, and the warmth coming off them carries with it the faint sour note of fermented grain, the specific smell of bread that was left to prove overnight in a cold kitchen and baked at dawn. A standard loaf, the kind produced under the assize of bread, a royal regulation requiring that bakers maintain consistent size and weight, or face consequences involving a very specific basket and a very public walk through the market, costs roughly a farthing. That is 1/4 of 1 penny. You have a penny. The farthing is a coin that technically exists but is in short supply. More commonly, a farthing is produced by cutting a penny into 4 pieces using the cross on its face as a guide. The 4 pieces are not equal. They are rarely even close. The baker knows this. You know this. You both know that whatever fragment of penny changes hands is going to require a moment of silent appraisal before this transaction moves forward. Above the penny, the denominations continue their own logic. 12 pennies make a shilling, 20 shillings make a pound, which means 1 pound is 240 pennies. This is not a decimal system. There is no decimal system. The relationship between these units was inherited from a Roman currency structure that no longer exists, passed through a Carolingian monetary framework that also no longer exists, and arrived in your present moment as a set of conversion ratios that must be performed entirely in the head, without a pencil, by people who in many cases cannot read. The baker is waiting. You don't have a farthing. You have a penny. If the baker cannot make change, and he may not be able to, because change is everyone's problem, and no one has solved it, you will either agree to settle the difference later and walk away carrying an informal social debt that both of you will remember for the next several years, or you will buy 4 loaves of bread you did not plan to purchase and carry them home. Medieval people are very good at not needing change. It has been necessary. The penny in your pocket may not be the weight it appears to be. This is not idle suspicion. It is a statistical likelihood in 13th century England, where a practice known as coin clipping has been running quietly in the background of the economy for as long as coins have existed, and will continue running until someone devises a structural solution, which is not happening today. The technique is not complicated. You take a coin, you file or shave the outer edge with a small tool, and you collect the silver dust or shavings. You do this to enough coins, and you accumulate raw material. You melt it down, and eventually it becomes a new coin, which you spend at face value. The original lightened coins, meanwhile, circulate normally. They look fine. They feel fine. Unless you are holding a precision scale beside a standard weight, which you are not, and neither is anyone else you will meet today. The difference is invisible. It is, on paper, illegal. It is also widespread enough that the institutional response to it will span several centuries. A clipped coin looks to any reasonable eye normal. It is still roughly circular. It still carries the king's face. It may be marginally smaller, slightly lighter, but coins struck by hand vary anyway, since no two left the die identically. You are making a judgment call every time you accept a coin. The vendor at the market is also making a judgment call. He has been making it longer than you. The long-term solution, the structural one, is the milled edge, a ring of fine ridges pressed around the rim of the coin during striking, so that any removal of metal is immediately visible. Any smooth stretch where ridges should be is evidence. The solution is practical, elegant, and does not exist yet. Sir Isaac Newton, who will one day become master of the mint in part because the coin clipping epidemic strikes him as a problem with a correct answer, will introduce milled edges in the late 17th century. You are in the 13th century. You pull your penny from your pocket and look at its edge in the flat grey morning light. Smooth, as edges are. Nothing obviously wrong. This is, of course, precisely how the system works. You put the coin back. The bread smell is still coming from the direction of the market, mixing now with wood smoke and the damp earth smell that follows a night of rain. The morning is cold and the ground is soft underfoot. Whatever your coin is actually worth, you're about to find out. The market is louder than you expected and smells worse than you hoped. Every town of any size holds a market day, sometimes twice a week, governed by a royal charter specifying which goods can be sold, by whom, and when. The charter does not specify prices. That part is left to the negotiation between the person selling and the person buying, conducted in real time. Which means that the price of a cabbage at this stall is not the price of a cabbage at the stall beside it, and neither is the price it fetched last Tuesday. And all three figures will be different again on the morning before a frost, when supply has taken an unexpected turn for the worse. There is no price list. There is no posted rate. There is only the vendor, the buyer, and whatever number they can agree on before one of them loses patience. You approach the bread stall. The baker looks at your coin with the expression of a man who recognizes exactly what he has been handed and has not been surprised by it in some time. He turns it in his fingers. He weighs it briefly in his palm, not with a scale, with his hand, which has held enough coins to notice when something is short. He makes a sound that doesn't mean yes and doesn't mean no. Bread pricing is governed by the assize of bread and ale, one of the earliest consumer protection statutes in English history. The regulation ties the size and price of a loaf to the current cost of wheat, which means the price shifts with every harvest, and the baker is legally required to adjust accordingly. This is better than no regulation at all. The alternative, which various municipalities attempted at various points, produced results described in the historical record, with the kind of careful restraint that suggests the authors found them difficult to look at directly. You and the baker arrive at a price. A sliver of penny changes hands, cut from the coin with a small blade. Not quite a quarter, near enough. You receive a loaf that is heavier than it looks, dense with grain that includes, in lean years, a measured proportion of other materials ground fine enough not to announce themselves. The bread is not warm. It was baked before dawn, and the market has been open for 2 hours. The crust gives with a sound like dry wood, and the inside is the colour of wet ash. You eat it, standing up, because there is nowhere to sit, and the ground is cold and wet against your boots. This is a successful transaction. Not all of them go this well. Further along the market, past the stalls selling dried herbs and rough, spun cloth, and a man who appears to be offering a goat he has visible reservations about parting with. There is a poultry stall. The chickens, hanging there, are not for you. This is an economic observation, not a personal one. Chickens in medieval England are kept primarily for eggs, and the logic of that arrangement is simple. A living hen produces an egg most days of the year. A dead hen produces one meal. The decision to slaughter a hen is therefore the decision to trade a reliable daily income for a single return. And that calculation only makes sense if you have enough hens to spare one, or the hen has stopped laying, or you are wealthy enough that arithmetic has stopped being a meaningful constraint on your dinner. The wealthier the people at this stall, you can tell not precisely by their clothing, since most clothing in this market is a variation on the theme of brown wool, but by the way they stand at the stall and point at things without asking the price first. Your protein today is pottage. Pottage covers a range of outcomes depending on the season, the cook, and the state of the vegetable supply. On a reasonable day it is a thick bean and herb stew, warming and substantial enough to carry you to evening. On a less reasonable day it is something closer to hot water with strong opinions about what it used to contain. It has been the foundational meal of most people in England for most of recorded history, and it will remain so for some time yet. There is nothing wrong with pottage. There is also nothing about it that stops you thinking about the smell of roasted chicken drifting from the far end of the market. You finish the pottage. You move on. At the edge of the market square, near the alehouse, with the low doorway and the sour smell of old grain that settles into your clothes as you pass, two people are having a conversation that is also entirely a financial transaction. One owes the other for bread bought on credit over several weeks. The second owes something back for labour exchanged in October, help moving timber, or help with a roof, the details varying depending on which of them you ask. That debt connects to an older arrangement involving shared use of a plough, which itself touches a question about who is owed what from a pig both families contributed to feeding last autumn. No coins will change hands in this conversation. No coins are needed. This is the economy that actually runs your village. Not the coins, not the market stalls, not the assize of anything. Beneath all of it runs a dense, unwritten web of credit, labour exchange, and remembered obligation that handles most of the real commerce of daily life without requiring anyone to produce a piece of metal. Historians examining medieval account records found exactly this. Entire communities reckoning all their debts in penny units, without those pennies ever physically moving. The coin is the language of the transaction. It is not always the currency. The system holds because everyone knows everyone. The village is small, memory is long, and reputation is the only ledger that matters. If you owe a debt and do not honour it, that fact will have reached 4 households before nightfall, and will be mentioned, with gradually decreasing relevance but no less precision, for years afterward. It also holds, it must be said, only up to the point at which two parties disagree about what the original arrangement actually was. Memory is reliable until it isn't, and when it stops being reliable, you get an argument that draws an audience of concerned bystanders and involves at least one witness whose recollection of the original transaction is equally partial in both senses of the word. There are ways to record things. A notch in a doorpost, a mark scratched into a piece of wood. We are coming to the piece of wood shortly because it deserves its own moment. For now, you watch the two people at the edge of the square work through their invisible accounts, and you understand something about this economy that the coin in your pocket does not fully explain. The money is the least interesting part of how any of this works. Half the debts in this village exist as wood, specifically as lengths of hazel or willow, roughly the width of a thumb, stripped of bark and worn smooth where they have been handled, split cleanly down the middle into two unequal pieces. You have seen them pass between people at the market's edge, tucked into belt pouches alongside things that are also not coins, handed over at the end of conversations like the ones you just watched. They are called tally sticks, and they are doing a significant portion of the financial work in this economy. The mechanism is straightforward. When a debt is agreed between two parties, a stick is notched and split together. The marks are carved across both halves simultaneously, so the pattern appears on each piece in a way that cannot be reproduced after the fact. Wood grain does not repeat. The internal fibre of a split surface is unique to that particular piece of wood, at that particular point, cleaved in that particular direction. To forge a tally stick convincingly, you would need to find two lengths of wood whose grain happen to match along a split line with the same notch pattern already present. You cannot arrange this. This is the point. The lender keeps the larger half, called the stock. The borrower keeps the smaller half, called the foil. When repayment comes due, both halves are produced and pressed together. If the grain aligns across the split and the notches match, the record is genuine. If they don't, someone has attempted something, and the wood has a longer memory than either of them. The notches mean specific things. A long, deep cut for £1, a shorter one for £1, a small nick for £0. A person who cannot read, which describes most of the people in this market, can nonetheless carry and verify a complete financial record, because the system was built for hands, not for literacy. It is, in its quiet way, one of the more elegant financial instruments this century will produce. You can also transfer the stock. A tally stick can circulate like currency. If the man who lent you grain in September needs to pay his own debts, he can hand your half of the tally stick to a third party, and now you owe that person instead, and you have not been consulted about any of this. But that is how instruments of debt have always worked. Britain will use tally sticks for government transactions for 600 years. Tax receipts, treasury records, royal debts, all notched in wood, split, distributed, and reconciled. In 1834, Parliament finally retires the system and orders the accumulated stock of 6 centuries of tally sticks to be destroyed. They are loaded into the furnaces beneath the Houses of Parliament. The furnaces are stoked too aggressively. The flues overheat. The fire spreads to the panelling, and from the panelling to the chambers above. And by morning, a significant portion of one of the most important buildings in England has burned to the ground. The building had survived the English Civil War, the dissolution of the monasteries, and 6 centuries of political upheaval. The tally sticks, in their final hours, proved more combustive than anticipated. 600 years of careful record keeping ended by the decision to feed it all into a furnace at once. Gold has a different quality to silver, a different weight in the hand, a warmth to the colour that silver lacks, a shine that reads as valuable before you have counted anything. You know this the way you know the shape of things described to you, often enough without ever being placed in front of you. There is a coin you have not seen, and almost certainly never will. It is gold, actual gold, struck in coin form, carrying a value so far above the penny that the two objects barely share a vocabulary. A gold coin in 13th century England represents a sum of money that most agricultural workers would require months of careful, uninterrupted saving to approach, assuming nothing went wrong in the interim, which it usually did. A single gold coin could purchase roughly 100 sheep. It could pay a skilled labourer for several months without remainder. It represents an amount of wealth that the majority of people you pass in this market will never hold in a single piece. Not once in the course of their lives, not even briefly. You are not holding a gold coin. You have a partial silver penny and a loaf of bread that has already been eaten. The gold coin exists in your economy, the way certain things exist in all economies, as a unit people refer to when describing amounts too large for ordinary transaction, a number that appears in the accounts of institutions and the conversations of people whose financial lives operate at a scale you can observe but not participate in. This is not a complaint. It is simply the shape of this economy, which runs on several distinct layers that interact without blending. At the bottom, the web of labour and remembered favours. In the middle, the silver penny and the market stall. At the top, gold and letters of credit, moving between merchant families across half of Europe, without a single coin changing hands. You are in the middle. The gold coin, if you ever see one, will be in the hand of someone passing through this market, without stopping. They are not here to buy bread. The afternoon brings a different smell to the road. Cart wheels on softened earth, the grassy warmth of hay being moved, the particular animal smell of livestock that have been walking since morning. The market begins to thin. People are going home. The man who owns the land you live on does not necessarily want your money. This is a distinction that takes a moment to settle into, coming as it does from an era where rent is understood as a number transferred between accounts. Feudal obligation is older than that, and runs on different logic. You pay rent, that much is the same. But rent in this century is not primarily a financial transaction. It is a relationship formalized into annual duties, and what form those duties take depends on the manner, the decade, and what the Lord actually needs. Your rent might be owed in labour, 2 or 3 days a week, working the Lord's own fields, more during planting and harvest, when his demesne requires more hands than his permanent household can supply. You are legally obligated to show up, to work at the pace he specifies, and to do so before attending to your own land, which creates a scheduling difficulty in the weeks when both sets of crops require attention at the same time, and that difficulty is broadly your problem. Your rent might be owed in kind, a fixed quantity of grain at harvest, a portion of your wool, a specified number of eggs at certain times of year. These obligations are assessed and recorded by the reeve, a manorial official who is typically a peasant himself, elected from the village, holding a position that carries modest authority and considerable social complexity in approximately equal measure. You may also owe fees for services the Lord controls, a charge to use his mill to grind your grain, another to use his oven, a further payment if you press apples in his press. These are not suggestions. The Lord holds a legal monopoly on these facilities within the manor, and using your neighbour's hand quern to avoid the mill fee is precisely the kind of arrangement the manorial court exists to discourage. Coins enter the picture eventually. Some obligations are set in pence from the start. Some rents are commuted to cash payments by the later medieval period, as lords find money easier to transport and less likely to develop strong opinions about storage conditions. But the habit of thinking about rent as fundamentally a financial transaction is a later one than this moment. For most of this period, the Lord wants your days, your grain, and your chickens. Whether he also wants your pennies depends on the decade, the harvest, and the man. The church bell rings once across the late afternoon, the sound carrying clean over the thinning market and fading into the grey above the rooftops. The church at the edge of the village collects 1/10 of everything you produce. This is the tithe, 1/10 of your grain, 1/10 of your wool, 1/10 of the eggs your hens lay, and the lambs your sheep produce, and in a year of surplus, 1/10 of whatever you manage to grow beyond subsistence. The obligation runs from early Christian tradition through English law, which means it is not a suggestion, and the fact that the harvest was difficult this year is acknowledged with what feels like genuine pastoral sympathy, and collected regardless. You can pay in kind. A tithe barn stands in most parishes for exactly this purpose. A large timber structure, smelling of dry straw and dust, filled each autumn with the accumulated 1/10 of the surrounding fields. Or you can pay in coin, which the church is entirely prepared to accept. The church is, it should be said, not opposed to money. The church holds extensive and carefully developed views on money, on usury, on interest, on the moral hazards of accumulation for its own sake, but its opposition to money is specifically calibrated to apply to other people's money, moving in directions the church did not authorize. Money moving toward the church has always been understood as a different matter entirely. The priest in your village forwards a portion to the bishop, who forwards a portion to Rome, where it funds an institution that has been managing finances at scale for over 1,000 years and has developed, in that time, considerable administrative precision. The church is the largest institutional landowner in England. It operates hospitals and farms and scriptoria and guest houses. It employs account keepers whose ledgers would not embarrass a modern finance department, except for the illuminated margins, which are a touch decorative for professional use. What the tithe confirms quietly across a year's worth of grain sacks and wool bundles is the same thing the tally stick confirms and the Lord's labour levy confirms. This economy runs on obligation. Authority names what you owe, records it, and collects it. The instrument changes. The structure does not. The church bell sounds the hour. The market has nearly emptied. You have paid your tithe this year. The feeling this produces is not exactly peace, but it is something adjacent to it, and in this century that is generally close enough. On the far side of the square, near the better inn, the one with the wider door, and the smell of something actually warm coming from inside, there is a man who has travelled from somewhere far enough away that these roads are not something he measures in local terms. He is a merchant, not a market stall merchant, not the baker or the cloth seller, but a merchant in the older and longer sense. Someone whose business exists across distances that would take you weeks to walk, who deals in quantities that would fill several buildings, who has counterparts in Flemish cities and Italian ports and Hanseatic trading towns along the northern coast. He is not carrying gold. This is the first thing to understand about commerce at his level. Moving physical silver or gold across medieval roads draws exactly the kind of attention that ends business arrangements permanently. What he carries is paper, letters of credit, issued by merchant houses in other cities, by family members and long-term partners, whose names appear in account books maintained across generations. The mechanism is the same one you saw in the village, scaled outward past recognition. A merchant in Dortmund gives this man a letter addressed to his counterpart in London. The letter certifies an obligation, a sum owed by the Dortmund house, to be honoured on presentation. The London merchant accepts the letter, provides goods or credit in return, and records the transaction. Later, at a trade fair through a money-changing network, or by a courier carrying a bundle of settled accounts, the two houses reconcile, netting debts against each other, until only a small residual sum needs to move in metal. It is the tally stick, but the stick is paper, and the parties are 1,000 miles apart, and the trust that holds it together has been built over decades of reliable settlement rather than decades of shared village memory. The network is older than any of its members and will outlast all of them. Its members are connected by family, by religion, by reputation, and by the accumulated weight of transactions that were honoured when they could have been refused. You are not in this network. You do not have a seal or a counterpart in Flanders or a family name that travels. You have a partial penny and a tally stick relationship with the man who sold you eggs, and those are useful instruments within the radius where your face is known. The merchant crosses the square without pausing at any of its stalls. The economy he inhabits and the one you inhabit occupy the same century without sharing much else. The day is cooling now, the light going flat and pale behind low cloud. The smell of the morning's market, replaced by the quieter smell of damp wood and cold air, and the faint trace of smoke beginning to rise from the household fires being lit against the coming evening. The last of the stalls are packing up. Vendors fold cloth into bundles, load unsold goods onto carts, move with the particular efficiency of people who have been standing in the cold since before dawn and are ready to stop. You have, let us say, fish. The fish was not the plan. The plan involved a more flexible commodity, grain or labour or wool, something that moves easily between hands and rarely triggers the response you are currently receiving, which is polite indifference. Fish arrived through a sequence of circumstances that seemed reasonable at the time, and now presents itself as a logistical problem with a shrinking window. Fish spoils. This is the central fact around which this situation organises itself. You need cloth. The cloth merchant does not want fish. She has a specific and settled view of what she needs, and fish does not appear on that list. And the fact that you have fish does not change what she needs. You need bread. The baker is packing up and does not want fish either. His relationship with fish is that of a man who has thought carefully about the question and arrived at a clear answer. This is the double coincidence of wants, the foundational problem that markets and money both exist to solve. For a barter transaction to succeed, you must have something the other person wants. They must have something you want. and these conditions must obtain simultaneously in compatible quantities. In a small village where everyone's surplus and shortage are known in advance, this can usually be arranged. In a market, with strangers and variable supply, and a day that is nearly over, it fails with some regularity. The solution, historically, is to hold things people always need: grain, salt, labour, a skill that travels. If you have those, the economy accommodates you at most hours of most days. If you have fish and it is late afternoon, you have entered a philosophical problem with a practical deadline. You will find someone eventually, a household that ran short of stored fish earlier than expected, a cook preparing a large meal who needs more than she has. You will settle for less than you hoped and more than nothing, and the transaction will be remembered imperfectly by both of you, and by morning it will be resolved. This is, in the end, how most of it works. There is something clarifying about spending a day in an economy like this. Not comfortable, the cold is real, the bread is grey, the penny is probably short, and the fish situation resolved itself at a price you are still thinking about. But clarifying, what you have spent a day inside is money stripped of everything that accumulates around it over centuries of abstraction. No central institution declaring value from a distance, no number backed by a promise, backed by another promise. Just silver worth what the silver weighs, a stick whose integrity lives in the grain of the wood, and a web of remembered debts held together by the fact that everyone involved will see each other again tomorrow. Tonight, when you check a balance on a glass screen, a number existing nowhere physical, guaranteed by institutions you will never visit, representing an agreement between entities too large to picture. The tally stick will seem, if anything, more honest. You could hold it. You could feel the notches. The record was in the wood, and the wood did not change its story. What this market understood, and what every monetary system since has had to quietly rediscover, is that money is not a thing. It is an agreement. It holds exactly as long as the trust behind it holds, and no longer. And the people buying and selling and arguing and notching sticks in this square knew that in their hands before anyone thought to write it down. A notch in a piece of wood, a number on a screen, 7 centuries apart, and the same quiet agreement underneath. Someone owes someone else. And both of them remember. Long before she was Catherine the Great, Empress of all the Russias, architect of a modern empire, and the most formidable ruler in 18th century Europe, she was simply Sophie. Sophie Friederike August von Anhalt, Zerbst, born in 1729 in the Prussian city of Stettin, the eldest daughter of a minor German prince, whose title was largely ceremonial, and whose ambitions extended, at most, to a comfortable European retirement. The distance between those two lives, Sophie from Stettin and Catherine of Russia, is the distance this story covers. Her father, Christian August, was a decent man in the way that many decent men are: reliable, careful, and entirely unlikely to change the shape of history. He commanded a Prussian infantry regiment with modest distinction, and went about his life in the quiet German fashion of someone who had accepted his place in the world without making any particular fuss about it. Her mother, Johanna Elisabeth, was something else altogether. She was a princess of Holstein-Gottorf, with social ambitions that far exceeded the dimensions of the small principality they called home, and she moved through European courts with the practiced ease of someone who understood that the useful work of aristocratic life happened at dinner tables, rather than on any kind of battlefield. It was Johanna's connections, and Johanna's correspondence, that would eventually produce the letter from St. Petersburg. Sophie herself was an energetic, strong-willed child. She was curious about most things and persistent about all of them, and had developed, by the time she was 10 or 11, the habit of deciding what she intended to accomplish, before calculating whether it was possible. She showed no particular signs of becoming Empress of Russia. Almost no one does, at 11, in Stettin. What she did show was something harder to name, a quality that can be observed in retrospect, but is almost impossible to recognize at the time. She paid attention, not in the dutiful surface way of children, who have been taught to sit still and appear engaged, but in the deeper way of someone who was quietly accumulating information about how the world actually worked, who held power in any given room, and what would be required to move through that room successfully. She watched her mother work a court reception and understood what was being transacted beneath the conversation. She watched her father receive his superiors and understood the specific geometry of deference. She filed it without yet knowing what she was filing it for. In the winter of 1744, when Sophie was 14 years old, an invitation arrived from Empress Elizabeth of Russia. The Empress was in need of a bride for her nephew and heir, Grand Duke Peter, a young man of 16 who would one day inherit the largest country on earth. The requirements for the position were not uncomplicated. Elizabeth wanted someone German enough to be familiar, Russian enough to be formed, young enough to be shaped, and intelligent enough to be useful. She had heard, through the complex postal network of European aristocracy, that the daughter of the Prince of Anhalt, Zerbst, might answer these specifications. She sent for Sophie and her mother. The journey east was undertaken in February, which is the month Russia uses to explain itself to the world. The cold on the road from Stettin to St. Petersburg was not the polite, manageable cold of a German winter, but something with a different quality, entirely wide. Indifferent, absolute. Sophie and her mother travelled in carriages through landscapes that grew progressively flatter and larger and more conclusively white, through air that tasted faintly of iron and carried sound strangely, as though distance itself had been revised upward by some authority that had not consulted the people travelling through it. The horses were changed at intervals. The cold was not. Russia, as a physical fact, arrived before Russia as a political reality. Sophie noticed. She met Grand Duke Peter soon after arriving in Moscow. He was 16, bare-haired, and had the particular quality of someone who is simultaneously very easy to read and very difficult to predict. He was passionately devoted to his collection of toy soldiers, which he arranged on his bed in elaborate tactical formations, and reviewed with a focused intensity of someone engaged in strategic planning at the highest level. If the highest level were conducted in miniature on a mattress, he held the Prussian army of Frederick the Great in an admiration so complete it left insufficient room for any other serious interest, including the country he was going to govern. Sophie began studying Russian the same week she arrived. She worked at it with an intensity that alarmed her mother and caused at least one doctor to be summoned when she developed a fever from studying in an unheated room late at night rather than interrupting her practice. She converted to Eastern Orthodoxy, took the Russian name Ekaterina, Catherine, and delivered a speech in Russian at her reception ceremony that the assembled court found astonishing in its fluency for someone who had been in the country only a matter of months. She had resolved, as she wrote in her memoirs years later, to become Russian in all respects. She meant it as a statement of practical strategy, but it was also something more direct. She recognized where she was going to spend the rest of her life, and she intended to belong to it completely. They were married on the 25th of August, 1745. She was 16. He was 17. The ceremony lasted 10 days and involved a degree of orchestrated celebration that bore no relationship to the private reality of what followed. Peter had a mistress within the first years. He also had, more consequentially, the interests of a man who had no particular curiosity about governance, about Russia, or about the country he was going to govern. He dressed his personal Holstein soldiers in Prussian uniforms and drilled them through the corridors of the palace with an enthusiasm that the Russian court found increasingly difficult to regard as a harmless eccentricity, particularly since those corridors were staffed by people who had watched Russia fight expensive and bloody wars against Prussia, and who were beginning to form views about this. Peter's position was, broadly, that Russia would have been better as Prussia. He found numerous occasions to share it. Catherine found herself in the position of a woman who had been brought to Russia for a specific purpose, the production of an heir, and was otherwise treated as largely peripheral to everything else. Empress Elizabeth monitored her correspondence, restricted her access to court advisers, and made it clear through the accumulated weight of small courtly signals that Catherine's role was to be available, presentable, and quiet. The quiet part was not entirely natural to her, so she read instead, in the 17 years of her time as Grand Duchess, 17 years of political sidelining, of careful social constraint, of being confined to a role with a visible ceiling and watched walls. She assembled one of the more comprehensive self-educations in the history of European monarchy. She worked through Montesquieu's The Spirit of the Laws, which would later form the backbone of her own legal reform documents. She read Voltaire's historical writing, Tacitus, legal texts, treatises on governance and jurisprudence, and the structure of states. She corresponded quietly with people she could not yet be seen publicly cultivating. She attended the social events she was permitted to attend, said the appropriate things, and returned home to read by candlelight until the wicks had burned down. Peter had his toy soldiers. Catherine had Montesquieu. It was not, on balance, a marriage of minds. She also built, with considerable patience and deliberate care, a network of relationships within the court, guards officers, senior ladies in waiting, advisers who had noticed the existing arrangement of power and were not entirely certain it needed to be permanent. These were not conspiracies. They were the natural products of 17 years of careful attention, applied by someone who had been studying the mechanics of power since before she arrived. By the time Empress Elizabeth died in December 1761, and Peter finally came to the throne he had been waiting for, Catherine had been in Russia for 17 years. She spoke the language without accent. She understood the court, its hierarchies, its resentments, its hidden tolerances, and its pressure points, better than most of the people who had been born into it. She had the quiet loyalty of officers in the Guards, regiments who had formed their views over years of close observation. She had read everything available about how to govern a state. She had been waiting, with a patience that probably surprised even herself, for whatever was going to come next. What came next was Peter. Peter III came to the throne in December 1761 and proceeded, over the following 6 months, to demonstrate a gift for alienation that was, if nothing else, impressively comprehensive. He withdrew Russia from the 7 Years' War, a war Russia had been fighting at considerable cost, a war in which the Russian army had recently handed Frederick the Great some of the most decisive defeats of his career, and returned every territorial gain to Prussia without negotiating a single condition. He did this, largely, because he admired Frederick the Great in the way that some men admire a particular general, with a fervour that had somewhere along the way ceased to be admiration and become something closer to identification. The Guards' regiments, who had bled across 3 campaigns for the gains he had just given away, formed their views. Those views were not, on the whole, favourable. He threatened the Orthodox Church's landholdings. He dismissed the palace guards' formal protocols in favour of Holstein style drill. He wore Prussian uniforms to functions where wearing a Prussian uniform was a statement with a clear meaning, and he made that statement repeatedly, as if repetition would eventually produce a different response from an audience that was, if anything, more certain of its opinion each time. He also spoke, with an openness that must have been its own kind of extraordinary, of divorcing Catherine and marrying his mistress. Catherine, meanwhile, had been having conversations. On the morning of the 28th of June, 1762, she was driven from the small palace at Peterhof to the barracks of the Izmailovsky Guards regiment before dawn. What happened next happened quickly, in the particular way that things which have been building for 17 years tend to happen quickly once they start. The soldiers came out of their barracks, they knelt, they cheered. Word spread to the Semyonovsky regiment, and the Semyonovsky regiment cheered as well. Catherine was driven to the Kazan Cathedral in St. Petersburg, where the Archbishop proclaimed her Empress of Russia, and then to the Winter Palace, where the remaining regiments formed up and were of the same general view. She was wearing a borrowed uniform coat, specifically a Semyonovsky regiment coat, because she had no military dress of her own, and there had not been time to arrange one. She wore it for the rest of that long day, riding between the regiments, and it is the image that appears in the paintings. The Empress on horseback in a green coat that was not hers, which is perhaps the most accurate possible representation of the situation. Peter was informed at Peterhof that he no longer had an empire he offered, in negotiation to share the throne. He was told this was not an available option. He wrote an abdication letter and asked for 3 things: his dog, his violin, and his mistress. He received none of them. He was taken to the small estate at Ropsha, where 8 days later he died officially of hemorrhoidal colic, a diagnosis that satisfied almost no one at the time, and has satisfied no historian since. The evidence points toward Alexei Orlov, probably acting without direct orders, certainly without being stopped. Catherine never ordered it. She also never ordered an investigation. She never spoke of it in writing. The matter was treated, for the remainder of her reign, as something that had resolved itself through processes best left unexamined. She was 33 years old. She had been in Russia for 18 years. She was now its empress, and she intended to govern it. She governed it for 34 years. The nakaz arrived in 1767, a document Catherine wrote herself, running to more than 500 articles, drawing on Montesquieu's The Spirit of the Laws, on the criminal justice reforms of Cesare Beccaria, on her own 17 years of reading and annotation and thinking about what a rational legal system might actually look like. It was addressed to a legislative commission she had convened to consider a new law code for Russia. Delegates from every class and region of the country, an unprecedented consultation. The nakaz was translated into French, German, Latin and Polish. Frederick the Great read it. Voltaire wrote to congratulate her. Several European governments found it progressive enough to ban. The law code the commission was convened to produce was never completed. The commission debated for a year and a half, was then dissolved, and the nakaz remained what it had always been, a statement of principles rather than a body of enacted law. This was not exactly a failure. It was more the shape of how Enlightenment ideals tended to travel when they encountered existing institutions, with energy and ambition on the page, and considerably more friction in the room. She corresponded with Voltaire for 15 years. She wrote to Diderot, to D'Alembert, to the intellectuals whose books she had read in cold apartments during her years as Grand Duchess. When Diderot fell into serious debt and was forced to consider selling his library, she bought the entire collection, paid him an annual salary to serve as its librarian, and left the books in his house in Paris where he could use them until his death. She invited him to St. Petersburg, where he came in 1773 and spent several months in conversation with her. He noted in his letters afterward that the Empress was not quite what he had expected, more practical, more direct, and considerably harder to move with abstract principle than he had initially supposed. She founded the Hermitage in 1764, initially her private collection of acquired paintings, installed in the small building beside the Winter Palace. It grew steadily for the rest of her reign, as she purchased collections from across Europe, with the particular acquisitiveness of someone who had grown up with nothing remarkable on any wall and intended to correct this on a substantial scale. It is now one of the largest art museums in the world. She founded the Smolny Institute in the same year, the first state-funded institution of higher education for women in Russia. She expanded hospitals, established the Free Economic Society, won 2 major wars against the Ottoman Empire, and added Crimea to Russian territory in 1783 through a process managed largely by Grigory Potemkin. Potemkin had become, over the preceding decade, simultaneously her greatest general, her most effective administrator, the probable architect of Russian expansion in the south, and, by most credible accounts, her secret husband. Their correspondence, thousands of letters, ranging from the tactical to the tender, and occasionally to the incandescent, reveals an intellectual and emotional intimacy that none of her other relationships approached. The legend of the Potemkin villages, that he constructed elaborate false facades of prosperous settlements along the Dnieper River to deceive Catherine during her 1787 tour, was invented by his enemies and circulated by foreign diplomats, who had reasons of their own to diminish what he had actually accomplished. What he had actually accomplished was the administrative organization of a vast territory, the founding of cities, the development of a Black Sea fleet, and the transformation of a region that had been unstable frontier into something with roads, institutions, and population. The villages were real. The facades were the story people told, because the real version required acknowledging what he had built. Potemkin died in October 1791 on a road in the Moldavian steppe, removed from his travelling coach because he could no longer bear the jolting of the carriage, laid on a blanket in the open air, and died there in the afternoon sun. He was 52 when the courier arrived in St. Petersburg. Catherine, by her own account, and the accounts of those around her, wept for days. There were 5 years left in her reign. The question of Catherine's private life occupied the courts of Europe, considerably more than it occupied Catherine. After Orlov, there was a succession of men who held the position of official court favourite, a role that carried genuine political weight, since favourites received titles, estates, and access that other people at court did not. Potemkin occupied a category of his own before and after his formal tenure in that role. The later favourites were younger, less consequential, and generated in proportion to their inconsequentiality a considerable volume of court whisper that spread westward through diplomatic correspondence and became the raw material of foreign satire. The stories that circulated about Catherine in European pamphlets and caricatures were, without exception, invented. The most famous one, involving a horse, has no basis in any contemporary account, was not mentioned by any witness to her life or court, and appears to have been manufactured by satirists working in the tradition of undermining powerful women through the most effective mechanism available, which requires no evidence and is impossible to conclusively disprove. It worked better than most political interventions of the era. It is still in circulation. A male monarch with Catherine's documented relationships would have been described in the historical record as vigorous and kingly. She governed 34 years and was remembered, in some corners, primarily for a horse that was never theirs. In the autumn of 1773, a man named Yemlian Pugachev appeared on the southern steppe and announced that he was Peter III, not dead, as it had been broadly understood, not buried at the Alexander Nevsky Monastery, with a diagnosis that satisfied no one, alive in the Ural region, returned from captivity, ready to reclaim what was his. He named himself Peter III, the man who had asked for his dog and violin, the man who had given away Russia's victories, the man who had died at a small estate 8 days after abdicating. He chose him as his symbol, which says something about the available options and rather more about the enduring power of a grievance to outlast its original occasion. Pugachev had, within months, an army. He drew them from every layer of society that Catherine's empire had not successfully absorbed or pacified. Cossack communities whose traditional freedoms had been curtailed by the centralizing policies of successive czars, serfs for whom the Enlightenment had produced no practical improvement and whose situation had, in several measurable respects, worsened. Factory workers in the Ural mining regions, Bashkirs, Tatars, and other national minorities whose relationship with Russian imperial authority ranged from complicated to hostile. At the rebellion's peak, estimates placed his following in the hundreds of thousands. Towns fell. Noble estates burned across the Volga and Ural regions. The Russian south descended into a violence that the official correspondence of that winter carefully declined to describe in its full dimensions. Catherine maintained in public a composure that was itself a form of governance. She did not cancel her scheduled court events. She did not communicate panic through her official dispatches. She managed the military response through private channels, moved commanders into position without the kind of public urgency that would have confirmed what the rumour networks of the capital were already carrying. It took nearly 2 years. Pugachev was captured in 1775 and brought to Moscow in a cage. Literally, in a cage, on a cart, for the journey from the steppe. And executed in January of that year, the execution conducted by the same judicial system that the Knackers had, 8 years earlier, proposed reforming along more humane Enlightenment lines. She attended, in the event, to the outcome, rather than the method. What Pugachev showed her was the distance between the Russia she had been governing and the Russia that existed. The Knackers had proposed a rational legal code. The serfs had proposed Pugachev. The gap between those two responses to the same set of conditions was not something that could be bridged by good correspondence with Voltaire. After 1775, her reforms moved more carefully. The administrative structure of the provinces was tightened and centralized. The powers of the nobility over their serfs were expanded rather than curtailed. The same nobility whose support had made the coup possible and whose continued loyalty made the reign stable. The Enlightenment project did not end, it became more selective. The manuscripts continued to move between St. Petersburg and Paris. The practical conditions of the people whose lives they described in the abstract changed more slowly, and in some cases not in the direction the manuscripts suggested. She knew this. It was the thing she did not write about. In the voluminous correspondence she left behind. In 1791, Potemkin died, and she governed alone. There were, in those final years, younger men who occupied the formal position of court favourite. The last of them, Platon Zubov, was barely out of his 20s when Catherine was past 60, and the court found the arrangement a productive source of private commentary, as courts do. Catherine seems to have been less interested in the commentary than in the governing. She continued receiving ambassadors, issuing decrees, managing what had become, over 3.5 decades, one of the largest administrative enterprises on the continent. She wrote letters, she read. The candles still burned late in the rooms where she worked. On the morning of the 17th of November, 1796, she did not appear for breakfast. She was found on the floor of her dressing room, having suffered a stroke at some point in the night or early morning. She was moved to a bed. She never regained consciousness. She died that evening. The manner of her death generated, almost immediately, the same tradition that had followed her throughout her life. Speculation, fabrication, stories circulated by people with reasons of their own and insufficient concern for evidence. None of the stories were true. The true account was that she was found on the floor of her dressing room by her attendants, that she was 67 years old, and that she died without recovering consciousness in the same palace she had occupied for 34 years. It is, if anything, a more interesting story, because it is the story of someone who governed until she fell. Her son Paul came to the throne and reversed many of her policies. He rehabilitated the third, arranging an elaborate state funeral for the man who had abdicated after 6 months and died of a contested illness. A ceremony that required the coffin of Peter III to be carried through the palace alongside the coffin of Catherine, so that they arrived at the imperial crypt together. It was, as a statement, considered by Paul to be appropriate. History has considered it chiefly remarkable. What the name Catherine the Great actually is a verdict. It was never a formal title. It emerged slowly from common usage, in the decades after her death, in the histories that began to assess what her reign had been, in the gradual consensus that the woman who had arrived in Russia at 14, speaking no Russian, knowing no one, with no claim and no army and no institutional support of any kind, had nonetheless left it larger, richer and more consequential than she found it. The name settled in the way that some names settle, because no other arrangement of words quite covered the distance. What she built is still standing, or still open, or still in use. The Hermitage holds 3 million objects. The territory she added to the empire through 2 Ottoman wars and the annexation of Crimea shaped the map of the following 2 centuries. The nakaz was never enacted into law, but it was read by reformers and scholars, and people in subsequent centuries who were trying to understand what a rational state might look like, and who found that someone had already written it down, in Russian, in 1767, in a room in the Winter Palace, by a woman who had taught herself the language. The contradiction that defined her reign was the one she never resolved, and never pretended to have resolved. She governed a society built on unfreedom, while corresponding, brilliantly and sincerely, with the leading theorists of freedom. The gap between those 2 things was not hypocrisy, exactly. It was the gap between what a person can imagine and what a person can actually change, given the specific constraints of the specific world they inhabit. She changed what she could and wrote, in private, about the rest. History tried to remember Catherine as a scandal. What it couldn't hide was the empire. On the sun-bleached island of Crete, a few miles south of the modern city of Heraklion, lies a ruin that feels less like a place and more like a question given physical form. Stone corridors double back on themselves. Stairwells open onto rooms that connect to further rooms by routes that make no obvious sense. Courtyards lead to storerooms. Storerooms open onto what may have been shrines. It is easy to lose your sense of direction, even now, standing in the 21st century, on a hillside above the Mediterranean. And even now, after more than a century of excavation, no one is entirely certain what any of it was for. Arthur Evans arrived on Crete in the mid-1890s, drawn by fragments of engraved stone seals he had seen circulating through antique markets in Athens. Small, dense objects carved with signs he did not recognize, which the dealers told him had come from Crete. He spent several years attempting to secure permission to excavate the hill at Knossos, where tradition and some earlier preliminary digging suggested something significant lay underground. The administration that controlled Crete at the time declined to grant a foreign archaeologist unlimited rights to dig. Evans waited. When Crete gained autonomy in 1898, he purchased the site himself, with the efficiency of a man who had been waiting some years and intended to make up for the delay. Excavations began in March 1900. Within the first week, the scale of what was underneath became clear. What emerged from the hill at Knossos was not a ruin in the ordinary sense. The clean geometry of collapsed columns, the predictable plan of a Greek temple or a Roman forum. It was something more difficult, a multi-story structure covering several acres, with room opening onto room in a sequence that suggested not a palace plan, but something closer to organic growth, as though the building had accumulated around a central courtyard over centuries, each generation adding and adjusting without erasing what came before. In the storerooms, enormous ceramic jars, pithoi, standing nearly as tall as a person, were still upright in rows, still carrying residue of the olive oil and grain they had contained 3,000 years earlier. In the floors ran drainage channels, carefully fitted and graded, a plumbing system, in a building from the Bronze Age, functional enough that water moved in the direction intended. On the walls, in fragments that had to be assembled painstakingly from hundreds of broken pieces, were paintings, dolphins arsing through blue water, women in elaborate formal dress, holding their hands in gestures of ceremony, and, on the restored panel that became the most famous image from the site, young figures grasping the horns of a great charging bull and vaulting, in a sequence of motion, over its back. Evans named the people who had built all of this Minoans, after King Minos, the legendary ruler of Crete who appeared in Greek mythology as the master of a labyrinth and the keeper of a monster beneath his palace. It was the only reference point available to him. Whether it bears any relationship to what the people who built Knossos actually called themselves is not known, because their writing has never been deciphered. The name has held for over a century, which is what tends to happen when the person doing the naming also controls the excavation. The central throne room was found with its seats still in place, a low gypsum chair with a curling back, set against a plastered wall, facing a sunken basin that Evans interpreted as a place for ritual purification. It may be the oldest throne still in its original position anywhere in the world. Whether a king sat in it, or a priest, or a priestess, or a figure whose role combined all three in a way the modern vocabulary cannot quite accommodate, is not something the throne itself is able to say. What they actually called themselves, where they came from, what their writing records, where they went. These are the questions Knossos produces. Among the thousands of discoveries Evans made in 1900 and the years following were clay tablets inscribed with small, precise signs arranged in horizontal rows. The script, which he designated Linear A, appeared throughout the site and at other Minoan locations across Crete, at Phaistos, at Hagia Triada, at Zakros. It covered the tablets in quantities that suggested administrative records, lists of commodities, inventories, the kind of transactional documentation that bureaucracies in all eras generate in volume. There were also symbols that appeared to be ideograms, small pictures of objects embedded in the lines of text, indicating what was being counted. It looked, in its organization, like a functional writing system used regularly by people who expected to be understood. Decades later, a related script was discovered at Knossos and at Mycenaean sites on the Greek mainland. A simplified version, drawing on many of the same signs, which came to be called Linear B. In 1952, a British architect named Michael Ventris, working from photographs of the tablets in his spare time, demonstrated that Linear B encoded an early form of Greek. The decipherment was one of the great intellectual achievements of 20th century archaeology. It also deepened, rather than resolved, the mystery of Linear A, because what Ventris's work revealed was that Linear B had borrowed and adapted the sign system of Linear A to write a completely different language. The underlying language that Linear records is not Greek. It does not appear to belong to any recognized language family that has left descendants in the modern world. The tablets exist in archives in Athens, Heracleion, and Oxford. Their contents remain closed. What does Linear record? Administrative grain inventories, or prayers, or something for which the modern world has lost both the context and the vocabulary. Around 1450 BCE, the Minoan world ended, not gradually, and not over the course of a long, slow decline, but abruptly, within a period archaeologists measure in decades at most. Every major Minoan site, on Crete except Knossos, showed evidence of violent destruction and abandonment. The pottery stopped being produced in the distinctive Minoan style. The frescoes went dark under fallen ceilings. The storerooms that had held olive oil and grain in quantities sufficient to supply a complex regional economy were emptied or buried. Knossos itself continued for perhaps another 75 years before it too was abandoned, its final phase marked by the presence of Linear B tablets. Mycenaean Greek, suggesting that the people administering the building in its last decades were not the people who had built it. What happened is not agreed upon. The eruption of the volcanic island of Thera, 100 kilometers north of Crete, was one of the largest volcanic events in Mediterranean history. It destroyed the Minoan settlement at Akrotiri on Thera itself, sealing it under ash in a state of extraordinary preservation that was not discovered until 1967. The eruption would have sent tsunamis across Crete's northern coast and deposited ash across the island in quantities sufficient to disrupt agriculture for years. But the date of the Thera eruption remains disputed. Estimates range from 1628 to 1500 BCE, and even the most recent dating places the event decades before the 1450 collapse, which means the connection between eruption and destruction must work through a chain of consequences drawn out over time, rather than through a single catastrophic moment. The Mycenaean presence at Knossos, after 1450, could indicate conquest, Greek-speaking invaders moving into a weakened civilization. It could equally indicate cultural absorption, a process by which Mycenaean Greeks gradually assumed administrative roles in a society that was already changing for other reasons. The Linear B tablets that are the clearest evidence of Mycenaean presence are themselves written in a script borrowed from the Minoans, which means the relationship between the two cultures was longer and more entangled than a simple conquest narrative can accommodate. Was it fire, or armies, or the slow accumulation of stresses that no civilization can absorb indefinitely? What Evans called a palace may not have been a palace, in the sense the word implies to anyone who has seen the great royal complexes of Egypt, or Mesopotamia, or Persia. The throne room is small and intimate rather than ceremonial, its proportions better suited to a ritual gathering than to a court receiving formal audiences. The frescoes of bull, leaping, the young figures grasping horns, launching through the air with an athleticism the painters clearly admired and rendered with precise physical detail, may depict an actual practice performed in the central courtyard directly below, or they may be symbolic, a representation of a divine or mythic act that the Minoans chose to commemorate without necessarily performing themselves, or they may occupy some middle ground between the literal and the symbolic that the Bronze Age mind inhabited and the modern mind has difficulty accessing. The double axes that appear throughout the site, carved into stone, painted on walls, cast in bronze, and displayed in sacred spaces, clearly meant something of significance. What they meant has not been determined. If the labyrinth wasn't a prison, what was it? The peak of Minoan civilization ran roughly from 2700 to 1450 BCE, contemporary with the Middle Kingdom of Egypt, with the Empire of Hammurabi in Babylon, with the construction of Stonehenge on the other side of the European continent. The Minoans were not isolated. They were trading partners with Egypt, with the Levant, with Cyprus and the Aegean Islands, and their craft goods and artistic influence appear across the eastern Mediterranean in contexts that confirm a civilization with considerable reach. Minoan-style frescoes have been found in the palace at Tel Kabri, in modern Israel, and in the Nile Delta at the site of Avaris. Their pottery appears in Egyptian tombs from the period. What the Egyptians thought of them, and what either culture understood about the other beyond the terms of trade, is not recorded in any surviving document in a language that can be read. On the island of Thera, modern Santorini, 100 kilometers north of Crete, the Minoans had established a flourishing settlement at a site now called Akrotiri. When the volcano that forms the island's core erupted sometime between 1628 and 1500 BCE, it sealed Akrotiri under meters of volcanic ash, in the same manner that Vesuvius would later seal Pompeii catastrophically, completely, and with a fidelity to the original that no ordinary process of time could have preserved. The site was excavated beginning in 1967. What archaeologists found was a Minoan town, arrested mid-morning 3. Story buildings with staircases still intact, storage vessels still in their positions, and walls covered in frescoes of extraordinary quality and range. Blue monkeys move through a landscape of red lilies and wheeling swallows. A young boy carries strings of fish. Adolescents box with one fist raised, wearing ornamental gloves. A painted fleet of ships passes between harbours full of flowers and watching crowds. Women in elaborate ceremonial dress, move through fields, gathering saffron. The specific, unhurried quality of Akrotiri's art, its interest in animals and seasons, and the textures of ordinary life, its attention to the movement of water and the weight of fabric, reveals a civilization with aesthetic values that have no close parallel in any contemporary culture. The Egyptians painted for permanence and dynastic power. The Minoans appear to have painted the living world in exactly the way it looked on a particular afternoon at a particular time of year, for reasons that have not been explained. What the art does not show matters as much as what it shows. No Minoan fresco depicts an army marching. No Minoan site on Crete was enclosed within defensive walls. An absence that is, in the context of the Bronze Age Mediterranean, so unusual as to demand explanation. Every other major civilization of the era fortified its centers of power: the Hittites, the Mycenaeans, the Egyptians, the inhabitants of the Levantine city. States, Knossos had no walls. Phaistos had no walls. Whether this reflects a genuinely non-martial culture, or a society whose security was primarily naval and whose fleet made land fortifications unnecessary, or simply a culture whose relationships with its neighbours we do not understand well enough to interpret the absence, is, in the pattern that has become characteristic of everything associated with this civilization, not known. Women appear throughout the frescoes in positions of evident significance, presiding over what seem to be public ceremonies, seated in positions of visible authority, moving through spaces, the images present as important rather than incidental. Whether this reflects genuine political and social prominence, or a specific religious context in which women's ceremonial roles were publicly foregrounded, or something the Minoan social world had that our vocabulary for power and gender is not equipped to name, cannot be determined from the paintings alone. The Minoan world is full of things that look like answers and reveal themselves, on sustained examination, to be more precise versions of the original question. Between his initial excavations and his death in 1941, Arthur Evans devoted 40 years to Knossos in ways that went considerably beyond archaeology. He rebuilt it, using reinforced concrete, the most modern construction material available to him. He reconstructed the walls, the columns, and the upper stories of the building, as he believed they had appeared in the Bronze Age. The columns are painted red and black and wider at the top than at the bottom, reversed from the taper of later Greek columns, because Evans concluded from the evidence that the Minoans had used wooden posts made from inverted tree trunks. The frescoes, restored, and in some cases substantially repainted by a Swiss artist, and his son whom Evans employed, represent his synthesis of what the walls had contained, assembled from fragments and analogy and 40 years of focused imagination. The tourists who visit Knossos today are, in a precise and literal sense, visiting Evans's Knossos, which is an interpretation of the Minoan site produced in the early 20th century by a particular man with particular assumptions. The distinction between these two things is not always clearly marked. Archaeologists have raised objections to the reconstruction since at least the mid-20th century. Some of the colours are probably wrong. Some of the structural choices rest on assumptions that later evidence has complicated or overturned. The frescoes that appear to visitors as vivid and definitive are in many cases small original fragments set into large fields of modern plaster, with the surrounding details applied by inference. The Palace Evans built from the Bronze Age ruin is also, in its way, a document of the Edwardian Age, of a specific moment in European archaeology, and a specific set of assumptions about what a great ancient palace should look like, applied to a building that may not have been a palace, and that certainly was not Greek. When Evans looked at Knossos, he saw things that confirmed what he had come expecting to find. This is not a criticism unique to Evans. It is a description of what happens whenever the present attempts to reconstruct the past through incomplete evidence and the irremovable medium of its own prior knowledge. The mythological dimension of Knossos is its own kind of evidence, though evidence of a different sort. The labyrinth, the minotaur, the thread of Ariadne, the wings of Daedalus. The most enduring images of classical Greek mythology are set on Crete, and they are set there because the Greeks themselves were encountering these ruins, these strange multi-room structures built by people who had preceded them, and doing what human beings do when they find evidence of a world they cannot read. They made stories. The Greeks made stories from the Minoan ruins that have lasted 3,000 years, and those stories became the foundation of a mythological tradition that is still in circulation. What the stories actually reflect about the Minoans, how much they preserve, how much they transform, how much they simply invent, is impossible to say. The ruins outlasted the stories that were made from them. The civilization that created the ruins has still not been introduced, in its own words, to anyone who came after. What are we actually looking at when we look at Knossos? The Minoans were present on Crete for roughly 1,200 years, longer as a continuous civilization than the entirety of what historians call the Western Roman Empire. They built a trading network that reached to Egypt and the Levant. They decorated their walls with a naturalism and an energy that their contemporaries did not match. They developed a writing system, kept records, administered an economy complex enough to require documentation at scale, and somewhere in the second half of the second millennium BCE, for reasons that the people who have devoted their professional lives to the question have not been able to settle, they stopped. What they left is enough to know they were there. It is not quite enough to know who they were. This is the quality that Knossos produces in everyone who walks through it. Not resolution, but an increasingly specific sense of what is absent. The stone corridors that confused Evans and continue to confuse visitors are not confusing, because the Minoans built carelessly. They are confusing because we are navigating a building without the knowledge that would have made its organization obvious to anyone who lived inside it. The tablets are too regular and too numerous to be anything other than systematic records, which means the answers to many of these questions are probably present in the sign system of Linear A in archives that can be accessed and examined and photographed and analyzed. The answers are there. They are simply, so far, not readable. Linear sits in archives in Athens and Heraclion and Oxford, still waiting. Whatever it says, it will not explain the leaping athletes or the double axes or the sudden silence that followed. Some doors were not built to be opened from this side. The merchants and diplomats who opened the first routes between China and Rome were not romantics. They were solving a precise logistical problem. How do you reliably move goods across 5,000 miles of terrain that includes the world's highest mountain range, the world's deepest deserts, and enough shifting political borderlands to bankrupt a careful man in a single season, and still turn a profit at the end of it? The answer, as it turned out, required camels, diplomatic marriages, an enormous quantity of dried apricots, and roughly 1,300 years of continuous human ingenuity applied to a problem that was never, at any point, entirely solved. The demand was real and urgent on both ends of the route. In Rome, Chinese silk was not a luxury in the way we use that word, something pleasant but optional. It was a status material so coveted that the Roman Senate passed formal legislation restricting men from wearing it, on the grounds that the outflow of gold to pay for Eastern goods was destabilizing the imperial economy. The laws were largely ignored. In China, under the Han Dynasty, the problem was different, and more immediately military. The nomadic Xiongnu tribes to the north and west had horses, fast, enduring, bred for the open steppe. That Chinese cavalry could not match in the field. Emperor Wu needed allies, and the allies he needed were somewhere to the west, in lands that no Han official had visited and no Han map accurately described. In 138 BCE, he sent a diplomat named Zhang Qian into the unknown to find them. Zhang Qian did not find the military alliance he was looking for. He was captured by the Xiongnu almost immediately and held for 10 years, eventually escaped, continued westward, reached Bactria in what is now Afghanistan, and returned to China 13 years after he had left, having travelled perhaps 6,000 miles on horseback through some of the most difficult terrain on the Eurasian continent. He came back with detailed intelligence, a Xiongnu wife he had acquired during captivity, and knowledge of civilizations the Han court had known by rumour, at best. Fergana, Parthia, a distant place called Lijian that scholars have since identified as Rome. Emperor Wu sent him out a second time, with a larger party and more resources. By the time Zhang Qian died, around 113 BCE, the routes that would eventually be named the Silk Road had their first diplomatic framework, which is perhaps the most consequential outcome of a journey that had, from the beginning, gone almost entirely wrong. What Zhang Qian established through diplomacy, successive generations refined through engineering. The fundamental problem of long-distance overland trade is not distance. it is resupply. A caravan crossing the Taklamakan Desert, one of the driest places on Earth, can carry only so much water and animal fodder before that cargo simply runs out and the caravan stops. The solution, developed over several centuries and maintained under successive empires, was the caravanserai, a rest station built roughly every 25 to 30 kilometers along the major routes, stocked with water, food, fodder, and shelter, and maintained by the political authority through whose territory it operated. In the same way that a modern highway is only as useful as the fuel stations built alongside it, the Silk Road was only as functional as the support network that made it survivable. The caravanserai system at its height stretched from China's western edge through Central Asia, Persia, and the Levant to the Mediterranean coast. A chain of way stations covering thousands of miles, funded not by any single empire, but by a succession of states that each recognized the commercial logic of maintaining safe passage through their territory. The Sassanid Persian Empire built and maintained caravanserais across Iran for 4 centuries. The Umayyad and Abbasid caliphates that followed continued the practice, adding mosques and bathhouses to the rest stops, because the merchants who passed through spent money, and the caliphates that taxed them grew wealthy from it. Some of these buildings survive. The Sultanhan caravanserai in central Turkey, built in 1229, is large enough to shelter several hundred merchants, their animals, and their goods simultaneously, and its vaulted stone interior, warm in winter, cool in summer, built to a scale that communicated both welcome and institutional competence, was designed by architects who understood that a traveller who felt safe was a traveller who came back next season with more to sell. The volume of goods passing through this system was, by the standards of the ancient and medieval world, extraordinary. Silk, obviously, moved in bales on the backs of Bactrian camels that could carry up to 450 kilograms each and travel reliably in conditions that would kill a horse inside a week. But also glassware from Roman Syria, moving east to Chinese courts that had never encountered it. Cotton textiles from India, pepper, cinnamon, and cardamom from South Asia in quantities sufficient to make the spice merchants of medieval Venice fabulously wealthy. Lapis lazuli from the mines of Badakhshan, in what is now northeastern Afghanistan, the same mines that supplied the vivid blue pigment in Egyptian tomb paintings and in Renaissance altarpieces, commissioned 15 centuries later, and paper, invented in China in the 1st century CE and moving westward along the routes, until it reached the Islamic world by the 8th century, where it was adopted and eventually passed to Europe, becoming the precondition for the printing press, the Reformation, and every book printed in the West before 1800. The Bactrian camel is worth dwelling on, because the entire system depended on it, in a way that romantic accounts of the Silk Road tend to underemphasize. The Bactrian camel, too, humped, native to Central Asia, of a disposition that experienced handlers have historically described as professionally indifferent to human preferences, can go without water for up to 10 days, carry significant loads across terrain that destroys wheeled vehicles, and navigate sandstorms with its nostrils sealed and its third eyelid closed. These are not small advantages when the route involves crossing the Taklamakan, a desert whose name in Uyghur translates roughly as you go in, you don't come out. The Silk Road worked across 13 centuries because the Bactrian camel made it work. The merchants who relied on this animal did so not out of romance, but out of a clear-eyed understanding that nothing else available to them could do what the route required. The Han Dynasty's portion of the road was divided into northern and southern tracks that skirted the Taklamakan on either side, meeting at oasis cities, Dunhuang, Kashgar, Khotan. That grew wealthy precisely because everyone who needed to cross the desert had to pass through them. Dunhuang, in the Gansu corridor, was simultaneously a military garrison, a commercial hub, and a centre of Buddhist learning. And in the caves carved into the cliffs above the city, monks from the 4th to the 11th century deposited manuscripts, paintings, and sacred objects until the caves held one of the largest accumulations of medieval documents ever assembled in a single place. A Taoist monk sealed the largest cache, sometime around 1000 CE, for reasons that have never been satisfactorily established. The cave was reopened by a Hungarian-British archaeologist named Mark Aurel-Stein in 1907. Inside were approximately 50,000 documents in 17 languages, spanning 1,000 years of the Silk Road at its operational height. Receipts, religious texts, personal letters, administrative records, and, in several cases, manuscript copies of texts whose existence was previously unknown. The operational backbone of the Silk Road, for most of its active centuries, was not Chinese merchants, or Roman buyers, or the Mongol armies, that would eventually make the routes safer than they had ever been. It was the Sogdians, an Iranian-speaking people centered on the city of Samarkand, in what is now Uzbekistan, whose commercial networks stretched from Byzantine Constantinople in the west to Tang Dynasty China in the east, and who functioned, for roughly 400 years, as the professional intermediaries through whom most long-distance Silk Road trade actually moved. They did not manufacture silk, and they did not consume most of what they carried. They transported, negotiated, financed, and connected. In the economy of the ancient world, these were the most valuable things a person could do. The evidence for the Sogdian merchant network is unusually direct. In 1907, a bundle of letters was found sealed inside a watchtower in the Gansu corridor. Letters that Sogdian merchants had dispatched westward in the early 4th century CE, and that had, for reasons that remain unclear, never been delivered. They were written on paper, in Sogdian script, and they describe with considerable specificity the business conditions of the Silk Road at its operational height, commodity prices, the behavior of unreliable clients, political disturbances that were disrupting trade, the difficulty of collecting debts from people who lived several months' travel away. One letter, written by a woman named Nanani, that to her mother describes being abandoned in Dunhuang by her husband, who had left for business without taking her along, and expresses a degree of frustration with this situation that requires no translation across 17 centuries. The Sogdian merchants were not romantic figures moving through an exotic landscape. They were professionals with receivables problems and difficult family situations, and the routes they worked were their office. By the 7th and 8th centuries, the Tang Dynasty capital of Chang'an had become the most cosmopolitan city in the world. A metropolis of perhaps 1 million people that included substantial communities of Sogdian wine merchants, Zoroastrian priests, Nestorian Christian monks, Indian acrobats, Turkish military officers, Japanese diplomats, and Persian musicians whose instruments appear in Tang court paintings alongside Chinese performers in a visual record of cultural mixture that no official policy produced and no single authority intended. The cosmopolitanism was not ideological, it was commercial. Chang'an was the eastern terminus of the most profitable trade network in existence, and profitable trade attracts diversity, the way water attracts everything that needs it. Tang poets wrote about Western grapes and barbarian music as natural features of the world they knew. The Silk Road had made them true. The period of the Mongol Pax, roughly 1206 to 1368, during which the Mongol Empire and its successor states controlled the entire overland route from China to Eastern Europe, represented the only moment in the Silk Road's history when a single political authority guaranteed safe passage across its full length simultaneously. The Mongols were, by the standards of their conquests, catastrophically destructive. They were also, by the standards of anyone who wanted to move goods across Central Asia without being taxed, robbed, or killed by 3 different powers in sequence, extraordinarily useful. The Mongol postal relay system, the Yam, placed fresh horses and riders at stations every 30 to 40 miles across the empire, capable of carrying official messages 200 miles in a single day. A communications speed that Europe would not match until the telegraph. Under the Pax, a merchant equipped with the right documentation could travel from Venice to Beijing in reasonable safety, which is approximately what Marco Polo did between 1271 and 1275. Polo's account of his 24 years in Mongol controlled Asia was so detailed, and, at points, so improbable that a significant portion of his contemporaries concluded he had fabricated the entire thing. Later, scholars have upgraded this assessment to probably mostly accurate, with some passages that reflect the understood conventions of medieval travel writing rather than strict reportage. What is not disputed is that the journey was possible, that the infrastructure of the Mongol Pax made it survivable for an Italian merchant to travel to the court of Kublai Khan, spend years there, and return, and that Polo's account, however embellished, was the document that gave Western Europe its most detailed picture of East Asia for the next 2 centuries. What the Silk Road carried alongside every physical commodity, was more difficult to weigh and more consequential to measure. Buddhism travelled from India into Central Asia along the same routes that carried silk westward, reaching China by the 1st and 2nd centuries CE in a migration that would eventually reshape Chinese philosophy, art, and political life more completely than any military conquest. Nestorian Christianity moved eastward in the 7th century, establishing churches in Central Asia and China that survived for centuries before the Mongol conquests dispersed or absorbed them. Islam spread along the Central Asian routes, with the Umayyad expansion in the 7th and 8th centuries, permanently transforming the religious character of every region from Persia to the Tarim Basin. The routes that connected the world also connected its epidemics. The Black Death moved westward from Central Asia in 1346, following the trade routes with the efficiency of something that had been designed for the purpose, reaching Crimea in 1347 and Western Europe by 1348, killing between a third and a half of Europe's population in the years that followed. The Silk Road did not distinguish between the goods it carried. It moved everything that could be moved. The psychological reality of the routes was, for the people who used them, inseparable from the physical. A merchant departing Chang'an for Samarkand faced a journey of roughly 3,000 miles, taking 6 to 8 months in each direction, through terrain whose difficulties were not abstractions. Travellers who left written accounts described the specific quality of the Taklamakan Desert, the way the wind produced sounds that experienced guides experienced as the voices of spirits, but that modern acousticians have identified as the resonance of shifting sand dunes settling against each other in registers close enough to the human voice, that the resemblance is not purely imaginary. They describe the mirages, the phantom rivers and phantom cities, visible at midday on the salt flats, and the bleached bones of animals and occasionally humans that marked the route's edges. The caravanserais were not merely logistical way stations. They were the points at which the psychological weight of the journey was temporarily lifted. A wall between the traveller and the desert, a fire, a meal that didn't require being cooked on a portable stove in a sandstorm. The company of other merchants who had made the same calculation about whether the profit was worth the passage, and had, so far, survived it. Vasco da Gama rounded the Cape of Good Hope and reached the Malabar coast of India in 1498. The sea route that he demonstrated was not, in the first years, faster or cheaper than the overland alternative. It was, eventually, both. A single merchant vessel of the kind the Portuguese were building by the early 16th century could carry a cargo that would have required several hundred loaded camels, and it did so without paying tolls to the Safavid Persian Empire, the Mamluk Sultanate, or the various Central Asian powers whose territories the overland routes crossed. The Ottoman conquest of Constantinople in 1453 had already disrupted the western terminus of the Silk Road and raised the tariffs on goods moving through Ottoman territory, making the maritime alternative more attractive to Italian and Iberian merchants, who had previously relied on the overland network. The caravanserais did not close, they declined. The business that had sustained them moved gradually and then decisively to the ocean. The overland Silk Road did not end on a date. It simply became, across the course of the 16th century, the less efficient option, and the less efficient option in commerce tends not to persist. The Sogdian merchant communities had been gone for 700 years. The Tang dynasty's cosmopolitan capital had been sacked and rebuilt and sacked again. The Mongol Pax had dissolved into the Black Death and the collapse of the Mongol successor states. What remained was the geography, the mountain passes, the desert routes, the oasis cities, and the problem that the routes had spent 13 centuries trying to solve. How do you reliably move value across impossible distance when nothing about the terrain or the politics makes it easy? The overland routes did not close. They receded. Through the 16th century and into the 17th, the caravanserais that had sheltered merchants, monks, diplomats, and plague, bearing rats across 1300 years, began to empty. Not because anyone decided the Silk Road was finished, but because the maritime alternative was simply more profitable. And commerce follows profit with the same reliability that water follows gravity. The great oasis cities, Samarkand, Kashgar, Khotan, Dunhuang, remained inhabited, but they became provincial towns rather than nodes in a living global network. The routes that Marco Polo had travelled under Mongol guarantee filled again, with the kind of danger that had always been there when no empire was guaranteeing anything. The Dunhuang cave documents, sealed around 1000 CE, lay undisturbed beneath their Taoist monks' decision. The Sogdian communities, long since dispersed by 7 centuries of political change, left no successors to mourn their absence. The most consequential trade network the ancient world had produced existed for roughly 400 years, primarily as ruins and local memory and the accumulated sediment of the desert over everything it had once been. The rediscovery began in the final decades of the 19th century, when a series of European expeditions travelled the old routes with the specific intention of finding what the desert had preserved. The Hungarian-British archaeologist Mark Aurel Stein made 4 journeys to Central Asia between 1900 and 1930, excavating sites along the Tarim Basin and acquiring, from the monk guardian of the Dunhuang cave, a quantity of manuscripts that ended up in the British Museum and the British Library. French sinologist Paul Pelliot arrived shortly afterward and acquired a further shipment for the Bibliothèque Nationale de France. The ethics of these acquisitions have been actively contested ever since, and the Chinese government's formal requests for the return of the Dunhuang materials have not, as of the present, been met. What the expeditions established beyond their diplomatic complications was the scale of what the Silk Road had produced and preserved. The 50,000 documents from Dunhuang alone represented a cross-section of medieval Central Asian life, its commerce, its religion, its personal correspondence, its bureaucratic record, keeping that no other archive in the world could match for the period. The nations that the old routes passed through have built substantial portions of their post-Soviet national identities on what the Silk Road left behind. Uzbekistan, whose territory encompasses Samarkand and Bukhara, 2 of the most significant commercial cities in the history of the routes, presents the Silk Road as the foundational narrative of a national heritage that precedes the Russian Empire, the Mongol conquests, and the Islamic caliphates by millennia, rooting a young country in an ancient claim. Kazakhstan, Tajikistan, and Kyrgyzstan tell versions of the same story, that the routes which made Central Asia indispensable to Eurasian commerce for more than 1,000 years represent an inheritance whose value hasn't diminished simply because the camels have been replaced. UNESCO's designation of the Silk Roads as a World Heritage Corridor in 2014 gave institutional form to what the region had known for centuries. That the infrastructure of the ancient trade network was one of the most significant human achievements on Earth, and that the ruins scattered across the Central Asian steppe deserved the same scholarly recognition accorded to the pyramids or the Colosseum. China launched the Belt and Road Initiative in 2013 under precisely that name, a new Silk Road connecting more than 150 countries through infrastructure investment in roads, railways, ports, and fibre optic networks that follow. In several cases, the same geographical reasoning as the Han Dynasty routes, Zhang Qian, had helped to establish 2,000 years earlier. The initiative is simultaneously a development program, a geopolitical strategy, and a deliberate claim about historical continuity, an assertion that the routes connecting China to Central Asia, to the Middle East, to Africa, and to Europe were China's contribution to the connected world, and that the modern version belongs in the same tradition as the bales of silk moved westward by Bactrian camel in the 2nd century BCE. Whether the initiative is best understood as generosity, investment, or strategic influence depends considerably on who is being asked. And most honest assessments acknowledge it as all 3 simultaneously. The engineers and theorists who designed the foundational architecture of the Internet reached, independently, for the same metaphor. The phrase "Digital Silk Road" appears in technology policy documents from Washington, Brussels, and Beijing, describing the global network across which information flows with the same underlying logic as silk once did, produced in one place, transformed in transit, arriving somewhere else as something that neither end of the exchange could have created alone. The metaphor is not decorative. The problem that the Internet was designed to solve: how do you maintain reliable transmission of value across a network whose individual nodes can fail, whose routes can be disrupted, and whose participants speak different languages and operate under different legal systems? Is the problem that the caravanserai builders were solving in the Sassanid Persian Empire in the 3rd century CE, and that the Sogdian merchants were navigating in their letters from the 4th. The solutions look different, The problem has not changed. The Silk Road is not a historical period. It is a method. The specific routes changed across 13 centuries of use. The northern track through the Tarim Basin gave way to the southern track. The southern track gave way to maritime alternatives. The maritime alternatives were eventually supplemented by rail and air and undersea cable. But the underlying conviction that drove Jiang Qu into the Xiongnu controlled steppe in 138 BCE, and that drove the Sogdian merchants to establish commercial networks across 5,000 miles of difficult terrain, and that drives every logistics engineer who has ever tried to move something valuable from one side of a political or geographic obstacle to the other, is the same conviction. The Dunhuang Caves are a museum now, visited by scholars who fly to a city that grew wealthy because of a desert route 2,000 years ago. The Sogdian letters are in archives on 3 continents, being studied by researchers who find in the complaints of a 4th century merchant about an unpaid invoice a picture of commercial anxiety and human persistence that requires very little translation into the present. The caravanserais are heritage sites, photographed by tourists, who stay in hotels built in their image and travel between them on roads that follow the same passes the loaded camels used, because the passes haven't moved, and the geography is still the geography. Somewhere in a data center in a city that didn't exist when the Silk Road was operating at its height, an undersea cable carries a quantity of information per SE-cond that would have taken the entire Sogdian merchant network several centuries to move in physical form. The people who maintain that cable call the network in policy documents a digital Silk Road. They mean it as a metaphor. They are also describing something true, that the distance between civilizations has always been a problem, and that the problem has always attracted people willing to spend their lives solving it, and that the solutions always outlast the specific technology of the moment and migrate into whatever the next form of the same old reaching turns out to be. The spirit of the Silk Road, that old practical human conviction that the distance between us is a problem worth solving, is as alive and as restless as ever.